A new study shows that the average Canadian family spent more than 44% of its income on taxes in 2018. That's a lot. Joining me now today to discuss this is Jake Fuss, a policy analyst with the independent think tank, the Fraser Institute. He's one of the co-authors of a new study called Taxes versus the Necessities of Life, the Canadian Consumer Tax Index 2019 edition, and he joins me now via Skype from Vancouver. Jake, welcome back to BCN.
Thanks very much for having me on.
Now, your study shows Canadians are spending more on taxes than on housing, food, clothing costs combined. Now, that seems pretty high. Can you explain how you came up with that 44% figure?
So our study measures the price the average family spends on taxes each year, and our goal is really to inform Canadians so they get a better sense of how much they pay in taxes. Now, it's probably not too difficult for the average person to calculate how much they pay in personal income taxes because we can look at our paychecks or pay stubs. But what's really difficult is looking at the other various taxes that we pay on top of that. So things like sales taxes, carbon taxes, and property taxes, and so forth. So what we try to do is add up all these taxes for the average family so they can get a better sense then. And as you mentioned, about 44% of our income is currently going to taxes, or almost $40,000 each year. So I think that's really important for people to understand.
So how much of a change is this compared to numbers, for, let's say, from 1961? How much did we spend on taxes compared to the basic necessities?
So that's a great question. So in 1961, since 1961, we've actually seen a considerable increase. So we've seen about an increase of about 2,200% or more in our tax bill since 1961. So it's been a considerable difference. And if we look back at 1961 as well, if we look at basic necessities, the average family used to spend about 57% of their income on basic necessities, while about $1 in every $3 went towards paying taxes. Now, if we fast forward to today, now what we see is that about 44% of our income is going to taxes, as I mentioned, whereas about 36% of our income is now going to basic necessities. So that amount has come down quite considerably, and we've had a flip here. So taxes are now consuming much more than basic necessities, and taxes are now the single largest expense for the average family.
So looking back to the 60s then, Jake, what was the average family income? It seems like a lot more families were able to survive on that one income.
So back in 1961, we had an average family income of about $5,000. If we compare that to today, it's now considerably higher at about $89,000. But I would point out again that back in 1961, even though the tax bill was lower, you still had about 57% of their income going to basic necessities. So it wasn't necessarily that much more affordable back then either.
Now, is some of this increase due to inflation?
Yes, so inflation does play a big role here. But even when we account for inflation, we still see that the tax bill has grown by about 176% since 1961 for the average family. So no matter how you slice it here, the tax bill has still risen quite considerably for the average family.
I understand that the tax rate has increased by a much higher rate compared to the increase of housing, clothing, and food costs. One would think that those rates of increases should remain fairly close to the tax increase rate. Can you explain the numbers and why we are seeing taxes increase so much faster?
Yeah, absolutely. So housing has risen quite substantially for expenditures for the average family since 1961 as well. So we've seen about a 1,600% increase in housing costs for the average family since 1961. And then similar numbers in food and clothing as well. We've seen about a 600% increase in food costs and about an 800% increase in clothing costs. So it is quite expensive. Now, in terms of why the tax bill has grown, there's a couple of factors here. The first thing is that incomes have been rising. So as incomes rise with our progressive income tax system, you're going to have a higher tax bill. So that's the first factor. The second thing, though, and the more important thing, though, is that tax rates have increased, and there have been a number of new taxes that have been introduced since then. Especially in recent years, we've seen things like carbon taxes, higher payroll taxes, removal of certain tax credits as well. So all of those things are going to act to increase your tax bill.
Jake, let's talk about the correlation between the cost of living versus rising income, especially from the 1960s through the 80s and into the 21st century, where we are today.
Yeah, so these have both been rising rapidly. Obviously, we've seen huge costs, cost of living being a number one concern for Canadians. There was a recent CBC News poll where they had cost of living as the number one concern for about a third of Canadians. And we've seen the cost of living, particularly in recent years, starting to rise. And I think important in this conversation of affordability and the cost of living is also the tax bill. So that's been rising quite substantially, particularly in recent years. So I think that's a really important factor here.
Now, Jake, when our governments continue to run deficit budgets, how does this really impact our personal tax burden?
Yeah, so that's another great question. So, in terms of deficits here, when you run a deficit as a government, what you're really doing is passing the burden on to a future generation. So, when you're incurring debt, what actually happens is that you have to raise taxes at a future date on a new generation in order to pay for that debt that you've incurred today. So, when we factor this into our calculations, it actually raises the tax burden on families even more.
Now, economically speaking, in order to run balanced budgets and to pay off the accumulated government debt burden, what are the options to really accomplish this?
Yeah, so there's really two options when you're talking about balancing the budget. So the first thing is to raise taxes, and the second option is to reduce spending. So when you're talking about the first option of raising taxes, there's important negative economic consequences associated with that. So the second option of reducing spending is probably a more viable option. And when we look at things like healthcare and education in Canada, we know that we spend quite a considerable amount on healthcare and education. So there's really options here, and there's ways to deliver services at a more efficient rate at a lower cost to taxpayers. I'm particularly interested too to watch in Alberta. They have the Blue Ribbon Panel who's going to be reporting on government, state of government finances in Alberta. So I think that's something to definitely keep your eye out on.
Shelter and housing was a pretty high percentage point at 21 points. So, how many people are not able to afford a house these days? Any thoughts on the real estate market and what could be done to maybe make houses more affordable?
Yeah, so absolutely. So some of my colleagues in the municipal policy department here have pointed out that governments typically only look at half the equation when we're talking about real estate. So they really only focus on the demand side, and that's unfortunate because we also really need to be paying attention to the supply side. So we need to be paying attention to things like regulatory processes, developer fees, reducing red tape for developers so that we can speed up and have more rapid approval times for construction and build more housing units. So I think it's really important to address the supply side rather than just half the equation.
Now, in your breakdown of the average Canadian family's expenditures as percentage of cash income, you have a category listed at 19.5%. What kinds of things are in that category?
Yeah, so this is sort of our miscellaneous category, or it's a catch-all item. So it's anything that's not basic necessities and taxes. So this can be things like household operations, pet expenses, transportation, childcare, entertainment, anything like that. So this one silver lining, though, in this category is that we've seen a considerable change since 1961 in that miscellaneous category. So families actually now have more income available to them now to spend. They have about twice the amount percentage-wise in income on miscellaneous items. So that is one definitely silver lining that we've seen.
Now, let's go back to the 1960s here for a moment, Jake. How much did we spend on food in the 60s compared to today?
Yeah, so back in 1961, food cost the average family about $1,300 or about 25% of their income. So it's quite a considerable amount. That percentage has come down quite considerably since then. So it's now at about 11% of your income. So there has been a big change there.
Now, what about clothing?
So clothing also has a similar story here. So it was roughly between 8 and 10% of your income, or around $500 before in 1961. And now it's come down quite considerably again in terms of your percentage of income. So now we're looking at about 4% or so of your income goes to clothing in 2018.
You know, I remember when I was a kid, I was 16 years old. I bought myself my first car, a 1973 Datsun 1800. I just had enough money, $1,000 to buy the car, but I didn't have enough money for the insurance, the registration, to put it on the road. So I had to wait another 2 months to put that on the road, right, to collect that money. Let's talk about vehicle ownership today. People have car payments, let's say $250, $300 a month. Then there's the insurance on that, the gas, the maintenance, and so forth. That must have gone up exponentially as well.
Oh, absolutely. Especially this is something that we actually factor into our tax calculations. We look at like motor vehicle license fees. We look at gas taxes as well. All of these things have gone up considerably. So that's certainly a big aspect of affordability for families. And that's also affordability in terms of your tax bill going to gas taxes and motor vehicle fees, which we include in those tax calculations. So it's definitely a consideration for families in terms of affordability.
Jake, it seems very clear that this rate of tax increase is simply unsustainable. Will we at some point get to a place where taxes will be, out of necessity, have to be rolled back perhaps to make it more affordable for families in Canada?
So this is something that we sort of indirectly address in our studies. So what we want to do is measure this in terms of the tax bill and inform Canadians so they get a better sense of their tax bill. But then what we want to do is that say that it's now up to Canadians to decide whether they're getting good value for their tax dollars, and then they decide at what point that the taxes should be rolled back. So we really want to leave this up to Canadians.
So a lot of those tax dollars going to healthcare, education. What are you seeing in your study?
Yeah, absolutely. So healthcare and education are huge chunks of the provincial budgets, especially. This is going to eat up even more in the future as we have an aging population in Canada. So I think, going back to the Blue Ribbon panel in Alberta, I think that will be something for people in Lethbridge to pay particular attention to, because that's going to have huge implications moving forward for costs for the government. And it's going to have huge implications for taxes moving forward as well. So I think that's definitely something that people should keep their eye on.
So you're talking to Canadians right now about this study. Are they willing to fork out more for taxes? Because again, we're supporting healthcare and education and so forth. Or are Canadians getting frustrated and reaching out to maybe their MPs or their MLAs?
Yeah, I think it's great to get this conversation going, which is what we want to do with this study, because ultimately it is up to people to decide. The reactions will evolve over time for sure. So that's definitely something that we'll be keeping our eye out on as we release this study each year.
And we've got a big election coming up October 21st. So taxes may play a role in this election here too as well. Jake Fuss, policy analyst with the Fraser Institute. Thanks a lot for joining me today from Vancouver.
Thanks very much for having me on.